Welcome to the St. Matthew's Episcopal Church podcast, coming to you from Northern Virginia. We're so glad you're here. Today, we hope our message inspires you to better know and share God's love. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and join our weekly newsletter, The Friday Flash, to stay updated on all of our events and services. Let's dive in.
Good morning. So, I remember as a kid, there was always the one Christmas present. You know, before I get started, I should actually take a sip of this. It'll leave you guys wondering, build suspense. There was always the one Christmas present that was in a big box, right? It was like awkwardly shaped. And what's interesting, it would get you so... It would get you so into wondering what was inside because it could fit anything, right? I mean, it could be smaller boxes. It could be the large BB gun you asked for. It could be a number of things. And it was always like the fun present. Everyone was like, ooh, what's that, right? So my kid's big box arrived after Christmas. My aunt had sent them a sled. It's a two-person sled. It snowed a lot last year, and there's some decent hills near us, and so they just really wanted a sled. They'd wanted it for a while. Not really enough snow this year so far, but that didn't stop them from being extremely excited when they opened this box and see this two-person sled, bright blue. And so they start pulling each other around in the sled through the house as we're concerned about the floors. And so when they're done that evening, they go to bed. I put the sled away and I put it in the playroom, right, the room with all their toys. I just put it in the corner of the room, stand it up against the wall. It's bright blue. And the strangest thing happens. The next morning, the kids ask me, where's the sled? And I'm like, I put it away. And it occurs to me as I'm saying this, like they don't see it? Like they don't, and I'm not going to tell them where it is because the last thing I need is to worry about those floors anymore. And so I just let it sit and I said, well, if you find it, you can play with it, right? And they, for days, could not find where this bright blue, 5-foot-tall sled was in the room they spend the single most time in, probably, besides their bedroom sleeping, in the entire house. And the more I think about this, I'm like, this is not unique to a 5- and 2-year-old, right? We do this occasionally as well, right? I've definitely looked for car keys that were in my own pocket before. And I think there's a lesson in there about how God reveals God's self to us. There's a problem in philosophy called the divine hiddenness problem, right? This idea that if God created the world, and if the God who created the world wanted a relationship with us, well then why would that God have made it so hard to find God in the world? Why does it feel like God is so far away sometimes, so hard to see? One of the many responses to this line of argument has been, well, maybe it's not God's problem. Maybe God has actually revealed God's self just fine, and the problem is with us. We aren't noticing the gigantic bright blue sled on the wall, just like some of you today probably didn't notice, well, I was going to say hundreds of rubber duckies. There were, before the 9:30 service, rubber duckies all over the place. I found one right here, actually. Here we go. Now that I've mentioned it, though, you might walk down the hallway into the parish hall and start seeing little rubber duckies all over the place. And it was amazing how many people, when there were 100 of them at 9:30, hadn't noticed them, or maybe had noticed one or two and thought it a bit strange. And yet they were in a room surrounded by rubber ducks. We are surrounded by God's revelation, I would argue. It's just that we don't notice it. And I would argue that that's one of the points of today's gospel passage. So let's look at today's gospel. John is baptizing in the Jordan River, and his disciples are hanging out with him, and Jesus comes to John. And we've read already this year, and in some other gospels we read about Jesus' baptism, but the focus here is on John calling out Jesus as the Messiah, as the Lamb of God. And John's disciples hear this and leave to follow Jesus. So we've got two disciples, one unnamed, one named Andrew. And so the first thing I want to point out is that notice how even Jesus' earliest disciples don't get some magical apparition, right? Some out-of-the-blue appearance. They get their teacher, who they've developed a deep relationship with, they follow around through the wilderness, even in the desert where the Jordan River flows, that they spend all their time with, their teacher says, hey, there's something special about this person. And they take that as their cue to follow Jesus. So again, not some magical apparition. It's instead this sort of someone just pointing out something and going, oh, they're like, yeah, okay. And it happens again, right? Because this unnamed disciple and Andrew begin following Jesus. And Andrew, his brother, we're told, is Simon Peter. And he runs to his brother and again says, we found the Messiah, right? This is a brother-to-brother transmission. And this is, I think it's important, right? Because the gospel here identifies Andrew as Peter's brother, right? Which means Peter's the more important person. And we know from both church tradition, but also even just from the New Testament itself, Peter had some leadership role in the early church. So the first readers of John's Gospels, they know who Peter is. He's a celebrity. And yet even celebrity St. Peter doesn't get magical sign from above, magical apparition. He gets his brother just telling him, hey, I love my sister, right? But if she called me up and said, I found the Messiah, I would be deeply skeptical, right? And maybe that says something about my relationship with her. But the point is that it's these mundane, everyday relationships. It was how God was revealing God's self in the world and how the gospel was spreading. It wasn't a series of miraculous events, although many would argue, rightly probably, but that chain of transmission itself is miraculous. It's a discussion for another day. So we are told throughout the Bible that this is how God chooses to reveal God's self. It is through relationship. In a couple verses before the section of John we read today, John just comes right out, the gospel author John comes right out and says, no one sees God, but they see the Son whom God has chosen to reveal. So even early on in John's gospel, we're getting this message that you don't see God. If you are waiting around for God to have this magical appearance in front of you, you're doing it wrong, right? It's not a failure. It's not a philosophical problem to be solved. It's actually how the God of the universe has chosen to reveal God's self. When I was, well, and I want to, let me continue this thought for a bit before I move on. That's also what we see in the Old Testament, right? It is God's relationship with the chosen people, with Israel, was the way that God had chosen to reveal in the world. And arguably, it was sort of before that, even through the law, through the giving of the Torah, right? What made the chosen people chosen is that they followed the Torah. By the Isaiah reading we get today, they had not followed it very well. Things had gone sideways for Israel. And so Isaiah is being told in this passage that there was going to be a servant that God was calling to be a light to the nations, a servant who would be sort of instead of, or a plan B to the original plan of Israel following the Torah perfectly. And of course, Christians have interpreted that servant to be Jesus. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. I just want to show that the entire biblical story here is about God revealing God's self in relationship. Again, it's not a story of a series of magical, sort of coercive apparitions to get you to believe. Revelation requires relationship. If you take nothing else today, that is the point that I want to get across. All right, I'll go back to the story I was about to tell. When I was playing soccer a lot as a kid, I did like travel tournaments, right? During the summers, we would do like an entire weekend in another city, 100 miles from home type of thing. And there was always a debate among the parents over what hotel to stay in. Especially in the days before cell phones, it was important to stay at the same hotel. You'd say, hey, let's meet in the lobby before the game. So this was always like an important detail. Have to pick one hotel for 20 kids, 20 families, right? And of course, some parents always thought the hotels weren't fancy enough. If you're going to Santa Barbara for a tournament, you might as well enjoy yourself. And of course, there were plenty of other people who said, let's just stay at the Motel 6 because we're here to play soccer. We're not here for a family vacation, you know, and these debates would go on. And my dad would sort of try to stay out of a lot of these debates. He always took the tack of saying, you know, it all looks the same when the lights are out and your eyes are closed. That was my dad's line. And it's kind of intuitively true, right? If you're trying to stay above the sort of, you know, the battle there of you know, which hotel to pick. On the other hand, the more you think about it, and I did because I'm that sort of kid, there's a limit to that, right? Like you can imagine hotels where your eyes might be closed, but it's a different situation, right? And I sort of imagine, the example that popped into my head is someone complaining about being unable to sleep in their hotel room. And you walk in and it's pitch black, they've blacked out the windows and the lights are off. And they're like, yeah, like I lay down, I close my eyes, I can't sleep, the lights are off. And maybe you plug in a nightlight and you realize like there's a hole in the ceiling, maybe something's leaking, there's like, roaches everywhere and bed bugs and, it smells bad. I mean, there's a lot of things that could keep the person from sleeping. And to continue the analogy, I think a lot of what we're being told about Revelation in stories like today's gospel is that what it takes for us is for someone to walk into that room and just turn on the light. That's what evangelism is. That's what being a light to other people is, as we're told both in the Old Testament and New Testament. It's literally just kind of reframing what already is, right? The assumption being that what is visible around is God. God is there. It's not that there isn't a God out there or that there's a problem of hiddenness that God is hiding from us. It's just that we haven't turned the lights on. And often we are so blind in such darkness that we can't even find that light switch. And it takes someone else, it takes an Andrew to turn the light on for us. In today's Isaiah reading, as I mentioned to you, God charges this unnamed servant with being a light to the nations. And Christians have seen and identified that servant with Jesus. And I think if we sort of apply transitive property there, if that servant's to be a light to the world and Jesus is like that and we are to be like Jesus, it's, doing the math, we are called to be that light to other people. Part of our role of imitating Jesus, of choosing to follow Jesus, is to be that light to the world, to turn that light on for others. Now, Episcopalians aren't super comfortable with evangelism. No one would say that that's like the forte of Episcopalianism is to spread the gospel, to get out the word. But what I do think we, and in particular people at St. Matt's, can be very good at is building the necessary relationships. Building those close relationships so that when we tell people why we show up at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning with that kind of weather to a church building, they believe us. We've had that relationship with them. We're maybe not as close as the teacher to disciple relationship, but something like it, right? Or maybe even closer. Maybe it's family, maybe it's friends, maybe it's just people we are consistently kind to in our places of work or play or commerce or whatever it is. People see God in us so clearly that when we look them in the eye and say, we found the Messiah, they go, okay, yeah, I want to follow the Messiah as well. That's the sort of relationship building that I think we can do really well. And I think here at St. Matt's, we do it and honestly could do it better. We take sort of discipleship seriously, right? That's clear. Like I'm teaching you now. We have, catechesis for the kids, and we have small groups, like in the sense of Bible studies or book clubs. We have, men's group and women's group. But it's not just teaching, right? It's also the community and the relationships that form in those groups. So what I would like to see, and what I think everyone at St. Matt's would like to see, is a continued reinvigoration of those small groups, of more small groups, more ways in which people can relate to each other and get to know each other so that we form within here those relationships that are necessary for being God to each other. And then, of course, those are the sorts of relationships we can invite people into. Right? They'll see the love and relationship that's going on, and people want to join that. People, for better or worse these days, are lonely, right? They don't know how to form relationships. Everything's on the internet, and very rightly, people are very skeptical of what's on the internet. There's a lot of nonsense on the internet. And so to the extent we can create relationships, well, that opens up the ability for revelation, right? That opens up the ability for for people to see God in their life. So reinvigorating small groups and also continuing to expand our children and youth and incorporate them into our worship here in this space on Sundays so that the community building and the relationships don't just go horizontally, but go, I don't know what the word, vertically, I guess. It sounds weird to say vertically because I'm thinking of heights of people, but yes, hierarchically maybe is hierarchically is the word I was looking for. Like where it's like people are hanging out, receiving mentorship from people much older than them in different stages of life than them. Those are things that I hear over and over again from people, especially young people, about one of the main reasons they come to church, right? It's because it's one of the few spaces in the world where they see people who aren't their same age, because you're grouped together in classes of similarly aged people for so much of your early life. So again, these sorts of relationships are what allow God to be present. God reveals God's self in these relationships, not in sort of me telling you right now without knowing your name, believe in Jesus. All right, sit back down. No, that's not going to do it. It's going to be the relationship that we have over an extended period of time. So that's what institutionally I think St. Matt's can continue to improve on. And my call to you today is to think about in your own personal life, how can you not just tell someone that you found the Messiah? How can you show them? Show it in your everyday life. How can you be Jesus to them in the world? And again, institutionally here at St. Matt's, our community outreach, all the service we do for the community, that's a visible way that people see God acting out. What does that look like in your individual life? Be the Messiah. That's what's going to bring the good news of salvation to people. So as Isaiah tells us in our reading today, God will give you as a light to the nations, that God's salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Amen.
Thank you for listening. If you're in the Northern Virginia area, we invite you to join us for worship or any of our events. For directions, service times, and information about our online services, visit stmtts.org. That's stmtts.org. Until next time, go in peace and share God's love.